Corporate Social Responsibility, Module 2, Stakeholders. Definition. Based on definitions made by several expert theorists on the topic of CSR, it is important to highlight that these three definitions concerning the concept of the stakeholder. One, stakeholders are those without whose support the organization could cease to exist, forcing the company not to focus solely on shareholders and stockholders. Any group of individual that can affect or be affected by the achievement of the company's objectives are stakeholders. Stakeholders of a corporation are collectively called those towards whom a company has a moral obligation. Thus, and as a summary of these three definitions, we can agree we call stakeholder all the actors involved in a business activity or somehow influenced by and affected by it. The CSR defines the idea that a company organization is a moral subject or a corporate citizen that generates for society and environment a series of positive externalities that need to be maximized, but also some negative ones that need to be minimized. Precisely, companies depend on society for their relationships, both economic and social, and so any action that the company carries out should be in accordance with the needs and opinions of their different interest groups. Therefore, it is essential that companies know all their stakeholders well and that they maintain an ongoing dialogue with them. Analyzing the three definitions given at the beginning, we can see how they all refer to two business approaches: stakeholder approach and stakeholder approach. Let's see which one of them consists of stockholder-stakeholder approach. The first approach is focused solely on the relationship between a company and its partners and shareholders. This business model is based on the neoclassical economic business theory and affirms that the company is and should be directed towards following the interests of its shareholders. As defended by Milton Friedman in his statement, "The only social responsibility of a company is to obtain benefits," the main objective that this model defends is the maximization of the economic benefits or the value of the shares. Thus, any action that is perceived as or performed is justified if it is based on reasons that point to an increase in the economic value of the company. Stakeholder approach. The second approach consists of all those individuals or groups that either by strategic reasons or moral legitimacy are necessary to achieve the objectives of the company. In this way, we intend to integrate with a single methodology the basic idea that a company has a responsibility towards different audiences or groups, including its shareholders, customers, workers, and managers. Their responsibility is defended because the groups have legitimate interest demands and or subjective demands related to aspects that may be related to the security of the products, which refer to the fulfillment of human rights or the environment, and that responsibility of the company due to its social and moral actor nature. Within this approach, two models of business management are visualized. The first part is an instrumental approach, and it states that the approach must be used in a purely strategic way in order to directly direct the company towards the economic goals that it needs in order to survive in the market. And the second model, based on normative approaches, it states that the inclusion of the point of view of the stakeholders in the conception of the company goes beyond the pure strategy, and that a common business project should be sought in the long term. The last model is what defines the establishment of the CSR policy in a company. Thus, it is agreed that a company has an obligation or moral responsibility towards certain groups of individuals, and only these can be considered, stakeholders. In this way, the use of this approach should not only focus exclusively on the groups that can support the company, but should also be set in a special way in those groups that have interest, claims, or legitimate demands. However, the difficulty lies in finding out when an interest is legitimate, why a company must satisfy it. It is worth noting that not all people in organizations are stakeholders. Thus, and given that only those groups that have a legitimate interest in the company are stakeholders, let us define the term. That a legitimate interest, something a law recognizes an advantage, profit, right, or share. And let us see the different types of stakeholders and the degree of importance they have for the company. So, 2.2, the types of share. When making a classification in the interest of groups of the company, different typologies need to be taken into account. Thus, we can talk about the following classifications: primary and secondary, key and emergent, or main and peripheral. The last one is the most commonly accepted typology. Let us see the following chart, the different typologies. So we have the organization, primary stakeholders and the employees and suppliers. They are within the original group. Now here we have the political action groups, and we have the unions representing the employees, and non-governmental organizations, and the secondary stakeholders. As we have seen in the previous section, only those groups that have a real and a legitimate interest in the company or organization are called stakeholders. And in spite of the characterization of the stakeholder typology, it is also important to know which are the different interests and what they have with the company, and consequently define them as stakeholders. These interests are the following: partners, shareholders, and investors; benefits, profitability of investments and management of resources; employee salary, social benefits, social hygiene, stability, promotion, employability, participation in training; managers, management capacity, the prestige and the income; the creators of opinions and knowledge, transparency, truthful and updated information; the clients, fair value for money, accurate information, health and safety guarantees, after-sales service, and the financial institutions, transparency, solvency, and fight against corruption, competitors, respect for the rules of free competition, reciprocity, fulfillment of commitments and cooperation, and suppliers and subcontractors, respect for free market values, ability to pay, clear information about commercial possibilities, respect for brands and industrial property. Local communities, countries, and societies, respect for national sovereignty, legality, fight against corruption, contribution to development and collaboration with institutions, the public administration, the legality, the contribution to development, collaboration with scientific, cultural, university, environmental, and NGO institutions, political parties, legality and contribution to the development, churches, respect for their beliefs and their moral values, unions, respect and promotion of social and labor rights, universities, research, development, and training. The triple use of the stakeholder approach, as can be observed in the definition of stakeholders and their importance in the management and implementation of business activity. The stakeholder approach, which is the basis of CSR policies, is the one that considers all those people and groups with legitimate interest as the activity of the company. This consideration forces a company to meet the needs of these groups since their image and reputation depend on them. It is essential to mention that the fulfillment of these interests does not have to be seen only as a strategic element to gain an economic benefit, but it has been to go beyond that so as to achieve an intangible benefit, which is vitally important nowadays. Thus, when talking about business management based on a stakeholder approach, reference is made to the threefold approach following actions: analytical use, strategic instrumental use, and normative use. We will see in detail that these three sections based on the works of Elsa Garcia, The Socially Responsible Company, Ethics, and Business. Let us first look at the analytical use. It is a descriptive analytical dimension that describes a company as a constellation of cooperative and competitive interests that have an intrinsic value. That is, a company is defined based on its stakeholders and the interests that they may have. When describing each other and every one of the stakeholders of the company or organization, we talk about three attributes. Power, all those stakeholders with the ability to influence the management and strategy of the company to communicate and defend their own interests. Urgency, presenting their interests can put pressure on the company. Legitimacy, interests, demands, and expectations of a legitimate nature. Now we can talk about the different levels of stakeholders. Definitive, when they have all three attributes. Expected, when they have two attributes. Here we can identify stakeholders who are dominant. They have power and legitimacy, but not urgency. Dependent, they have legitimacy and urgency, but they're not powerful. And dangerous, those who have urgency and power, but are not legitimate. Latent, when they have one attribute. Here we can identify stakeholders who are inactive. They have power but not legitimacy or urgent. Discretionary, they have legitimacy but no power or urgency. And demanding, they have urgency but no power or legitimacy. They are certainly not stakeholders when they do not have any of the three. Let us look over those again just for a few seconds. Power, urgency, and legitimacy. Now have a look at the graph extractor. Yes, here we are. Very good. Power, but you see 7, that would be the definitive stakeholders. Here you have legitimacy and power. They would be expectant as stakeholders, or power and urgency. And yes, okay, and then non-stakeholders, which is out here somewhere, and it's not even in the thing. Okay, 8. I guess there should have been an 8 here somewhere. Oh well. The main advantage of this first use when defining the different interest groups of the company is that it captures relevant information concerning them, and that the three attributes, power, urgency, and legitimacy, are key when defining CSR and the different actions that can be or will be carried out. Even so, it is not an easy task to identify the different groups and their interests, since it is not all groups are stakeholders and not all their interests have a legitimacy nature. In addition, the groups can vary easily, as well as power, interest, and pressure that they exert on the company. In this way, and in order to make identification of the groups easier and to define the interests of these groups, the creation of a series of permanent dialogues mechanisms with the different stakeholders have been recommended, as this will allow carrying out a periodical follow-up. Configuration of the stakeholder map will help the company in a descriptive way to situate its different interest groups, as well as to know their interests and concerns. The steps for the preparation of this map are the following. Definitions of the stakeholder map from the list of groups and people as completed and detailed as possible who have some kind of relationship with the company organization based on the attributes of power, urgency, and legitimacy. Preparation of a map of coalition of stakeholders. We must not forget that these different groups can be related to each other, and knowing what kind of relationship there is between them is key when developing a good CSR policy. Contrary to what some expert theorists have said, it is not enough. It only gives information, sometimes incomplete, about stakeholders. What we need are the other two uses to complement and to elaborate strategies and plans of performance. In this sense, analytical use is considered one of the uses of stakeholder management, but it requires two other complementary issues: the strategic, instrumental, and standard one. Thus, the analytical dimension will not be the one that allows a company or organization to develop moral and ethical management. However, it is of vital importance since it allows us to include all those concerned, as well as all their interests and possibilities and channels to communicate their interest and expectations. Now, the strategic instrumental use. The strategic instrumental orientation of the stakeholders approach is based on managing and directing these groups from a strategic point of view in order to respond to CSR. Based on the general approach, two models of strategic management of stakeholders have been developed, as well as different studies regarding generating strategies that are capable of satisfying the demands and interests of stakeholders that may endanger or condition the achievement of the economic objectives of the company. Two premises that refer to instrumental use are: the main objective of the strategies and decisions of the company is to succeed in the market. In other words, the economic benefit and those relationships with the stakeholders that are not productive or that imply an investment of more resources than necessary will be interrupted. Regarding the first premise, it implies that the company's vision of stakeholders is that they are one more element of the environment that must be managed in such a way that benefits, actions, and ultimately benefits to shareholders are guaranteed. In short, although the stakeholder approach is used to define the environment, the reasons for doing so are not the legitimacy or value of the interests of the company stakeholders, but simply the power that they may have in generating economic benefits. Thus, we can say that the management of the stakeholders is a means and not a purpose of the company. In this sense, it is not the ethical or moral reasons that support the management of the stakeholders, but the main objective pursued by the company is no other than satisfaction, progress, and improvement of its unique group of stakeholders, its owners and shareholders. In this way, stakeholder management is used as another strategy because it enhances and maintains the profitability of the company. This second premise is fully justified, as it is based on the idea that stakeholder management is only part of the strategy aimed at obtaining financial gain. If a specific relationship with a group of interests has a minor impact on the satisfaction of the shareholders' interest or implies an excessive investment of resources, such a relationship will be interrupted. And in this sense, the issue related to stakeholders enter into the decision-making process and design of the business strategy only if they have real strategic value for the company. Now, this approach leads to a stakeholder use that can be reflected upon two management models, depending on whether they introduce the relationships with the stakeholder as one more strategy to achieve economic benefit as a background for the entire business strategy. It is vital to note that these two models start from the previous description of their stakeholders, that is, from an analytical use, and they take into consideration what kind of strategy they have to decide to improve the interests of the shareholders or owners. The use of this approach allows a company to design and develop strategies that consider those groups that affect the achievement of their objectives, whether hostile or friendly, generate propositions or rules that facilitate the development of regulatory principles for the future, such as do not accept or offer bribes, respect the environment of the community in which you act, etc. Finally, the standard use. This last approach states that the fundamental base of the stakeholders is normative, and therefore it implies the idea that stakeholders are people or groups that have legitimate interest in substantial aspects of the business activity. Thus, it is a management approach. Not only does it describe the existence of situations, predict cause and effect relations, but it also recommends procedures, attitudes, structures, and practices adjusted to the company's stakeholders. The management of stakeholders requires the attention towards the legitimate interest of all identified stakeholders, the establishment of general policies such as structures and organizational processes which facilitate their integration in decision-making. The development of the standard use is based on the moral reasons that exist to manage a company under the stakeholder model, that is, on the intrinsic value of certain interest groups have. This allows us to state that this level of stakeholders are not only conceived as a means of achieving maximization of shareholders' interests, but also the certain interests of the stakeholders have moral legitimacy, and therefore a company assumes a moral responsibility for them. It is important to note that these three uses must interrelate in order to achieve good CSR management, which will help the company to obtain a benefit. In the following sections, we will see a specific model for the simultaneous use of the three approaches, which allows a corporate management that accounts for its CSR. And this model has been extracted from Fernando Navarro Garcia's book, A Corporate Social Responsibility, both in theory and practice. This model is presented as an adequate and valid management tool to manage CSR, as it suggests that the three dimensions, or the uses of stakeholder approach, descriptive, analytical, strategic, and instrumental and standard, must be understood in complete interaction in the management of the company. To manage a company or organization in a responsible way, the three approaches must complement each other. In addition, it aims to highlight that the management of the morally responsible company can never be understood as a temporary program or action, but must be an active part, that it must be part of the business decision, making its own business structure. The implementation of this model for business management it has the following consequences. The interests of the stakeholders can be qualified, and there are three types of interest: particular, group, and universal or generalizable. This model suggests that an ethical perspective of the stakeholders approach must adopt universal, or generalizable interests as a guide to define the CSR. The model requires that all those concerned with the business activity should be considered as valuable interlocutors whose interests are taken into account in the decision-making process and in the definition of plans and structures. The valid stakeholder has strategic, instrumental, and also communicative powers. That is, it is potential generating understanding and agreements on generalizable principles. The model requires dialogue to seek agreements on business rules and procedures that respond to generalizable interests so as the guide business management. This is meant to be, there must be an obligatory respect for the principles of universalization that establishes that a decision is morally correct when it can or could be accepted by all who are affected by it now and in the future. This dialogue should be based on four principles: the principle of sincerity of the interlocutors, the principle of inclusion of all those affected or their representatives if they are absent as a solution to the potential conflicts and present and future, principle of reciprocity among participants, including the absence of coercion or violence, and the principle of symmetry among all the interests raised. Based on this model, the concept of corporate responsibility no longer focuses only on the achievement of a particular group interest, but also contemplates the possibility of reaching agreements on generalizable interests, which would place a company in front of the ethical conception of CSR. Thus, we can say that with the implementation of this model, stakeholders would not only have a strategic or instrumental value for the company, but also an intrinsic one. On a practical level, the standard use of the stakeholder is proposed according to which a company is considered a social institution, social institution where different types of interests are different groups that are related to it converge, and those actions and decisions are susceptible to moral evaluation. Thus, and starting from the ethical approach, we can say that a company can be considered ethical when it reaches an agreement among all the groups involved. This agreement will always be considered as a process and not a fact, and the ethical assessment of the agreement will depend on the distance or proximity with the different groups of stakeholders and the condition of the dialogue. Thus, the moral credibility and legitimacy of the company will depend on the opinions of all those concerned. To finish, the management of the CSR based on an integral model of stakeholders that we've just presented can build trust in the business fabric, prevent and solve conflicts, improve the solidity of the company through a good representation, enhance the company's innovation and competitiveness, develop long-term business projects, and adopt management systems that allow risk management in the face of constant changing economic, social, and technological environments.